morning we will be in chapter 18, and we'll start with a little on-location video of the city of Corinth. Continue sailing around the Peloponnese. The problem with this that they discovered later, which they knew at the time, was archaeologists have found over 500 wrecked ships from the time of Paul, which tells you it wasn't a really great sailing area. So the option of going around the Peloponnese was really quite a horrible option. The second option was the sailors would sail these small boats into the harbor, into the southern harbor. They would park and they would wait their turn. And you would just have tons of boats in that watery little section you saw, anchored out, and they would wait, usually for up to a month. So you had sailors waiting for about a month, 3 to 4 weeks, with a bunch of money in their pocket until the slaves were freed up. The slaves would then take their ship, they would unload their cargo. Normally they would take their ship out, the big boat, they would take it out of the water, they would carry it across this isthmus, this landmass, to the other side, put it back in the water, reload the boat, or they would simply unload the cargo, carry the cargo across to a boat that was parked on the other side and go on. So again, you have to think of it. You've got sailors with money in their pocket for a month with nothing to do with 1,000 prostitutes to Aphrodite. Not a good algorithm. So when I saw the geography of this place, suddenly 1 Corinthians made perfect sense. If you want to go back and read the letter of 1 Corinthians and wonder why this church had so many pollutant problems and why Paul had to address the issues, it makes absolute sense. The land that narrows, this isthmus, here's the area, if you will. Go back one slide. You remember Athens? Brian spoke about that last week. It's just a couple-hour drive, if you will, from there to Corinth. Obviously, hiking is a couple days. You can see the two ports, Lechaeum up above and Cenchreae down below. Those are the two ports. It's about 4 miles in between. Now go to the next one. So this is a blow-up. There's the Peloponnese, so obviously going around that is a very difficult thing. But look how narrow that isthmus is. That land between the two ports, it's extremely narrow. And so they built this Roman road in the 6th century BC that lasted for 1,000 years. The pictures you saw in the video of this Diolkos, this road, that's the original Roman road. This is what I love about going on these archaeological trips. You're walking on these things and you're saying, I feel like I shouldn't be walking on this. And it's all full of weeds and nobody cares and people look at you when you're there like, why is this idiotic bus stopping at this junky old weeded road, not knowing necessarily what the history is behind these things. It was obviously a little longer than 4 miles because it had to weave around through the land masses, but not much more than that. Maybe from, Alamo to, say, Monte Vista, not far at all. The bottom line, again, is to remember what these sailors were doing in this city of a massive number of people. Let's begin reading in the book of Acts, chapter 18 and verse 1. If you don't have a Bible, there's Bibles in the chairs around you. After these things, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy, and his wife Priscilla. Apparently you could only be married if it rhymed in this day. Because Claudius the emperor had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, and he came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working for by trade, they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Just several observations about these first introductory verses. Luke introduces us to a couple new characters, Priscilla and Aquila. It's more than likely that these two individuals, this couple, were actually followers of Jesus before Paul meets them. And more than likely, Paul is looking for work in this place, is introduced to this couple who just so happens to have the same trade as he does, and just so happens to love Jesus on top of it. Aquila was originally from Asia Minor, which is Turkey. That was the sections that Paul visited on his first missionary journey. At some point, we're not told why, he moves to Italy. We don't know if he met his wife there or took her with him. And then we read in the text that they're forced to leave Rome, and so they're just recently finding themselves, like Paul is, in this grand city of Corinth. There was an imperial edict during the time of Emperor Claudius. He expelled the Jews from Rome during a very short window in Roman history because of the trouble that was going on. And we read this in the text, but we read this outside the Bible as well. There's one of the historians, Suetonius, who said this: since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, that means Christ, he, Claudius the emperor, expelled them from Rome. So we know from history, both in the Bible and if you're a skeptic, corroborated outside of the Bible, that the Jews were having trouble with themselves because some Jews were coming to Jesus, some Jews didn't buy it. They were having problems, as we've seen in every synagogue in every city that Paul has visited, and Claudius got sick of it and booted them all out. News of this went everywhere in the Roman Empire. So every synagogue that Paul is going to knows the history of Rome, knows what the emperor did there, and knows what a stirring up will take place. We have to remember that in the back of their mind. So when people don't like what Paul was doing in synagogues, you can feel the political reason why. Because they very, very literally can be kicked out of their city and have no place to live. The text also mentions this trade of Paul's. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. More than likely, most scholars that I kind of trust think that Paul wasn't a weaver, he was an actual leather maker. And so this tent making, if you will, was actually working with leather, which was the same thing Aquila and Priscilla did. And Paul is a teacher, very much like a rabbi at the time. The rabbis in Israel were expected to work outside of their gifting and calling. They were expected to have a craft, a job, where they made their money during the week, and then they would use their gifting and calling of teaching in the synagogue on the weekend. And Paul is following this ancient Jewish tradition to a T. He later shares in some of his letters that he personally believes that he deserved to be supported by the church. He deserved to have them actually support them, so he didn't have to make the letter. But he actually, other than pretty much this 18 months in Corinth, he refrains from doing so for a couple reasons. I mean, first of all, we already know that a lot of the problems he encounters in the synagogues, we're really going to find this as soon as he leaves here and goes back to Jerusalem. The remainder of Acts is Paul in trouble. That should be the title of the remainder of the chapters. Paul in trouble in Jerusalem because he's fraternizing with Gentiles and they don't like him. He didn't want to add to that kind of fervor, if you will, by having say, and oh, by the way, not only are you fraternizing with Gentiles, you're only doing this to gain money. And so Paul said, I'll make this easy on you then. I'll work with leather so nobody can point a finger at me. On top of it, Paul always saw the people around him, and he saw more need outside of his own life than in his own. Kind of a Christian theme then, isn't it? He was so filled up with God that all he noticed were the weaknesses other people had. And so it felt weird to him to take the money because he would rather have somebody with greater means do that. And of course, we also see Paul like normal every single Sabbath. When he goes into a city, he goes right to the synagogue, he goes right to the Jews, and a bunch of them start following Jesus, and a bunch of them don't. And like he finds all over the place, particularly when he went to Pisidian Antioch, they start creating problems for him. And Paul's emphasis of working outside, in this tent-making job and ministering on the weekends starts to shift in our passage this morning as Timothy and Silas, his friends, come. Look at verse 5. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your heads. I am clean." This doesn't mean I haven't sinned. What it means is I did the right thing. I told the story properly. I'm sorry you didn't buy it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. So until his friends arrived, he's working a job during the week, going to the synagogue. Now that support has arrived For some reason, Paul says, okay, for this period of time, I'll let you give me money support so that I can 7 days a week dedicate myself to this teaching thing. And as we've seen before, particularly in that city in Antioch, some of the Jewish leaders get their undies in a bunch and start creating problems just so they can get Paul to stop talking. And as a result, Paul shifts his message from the synagogue and the Jews to the Gentiles. And again, I say this every time, and I'm going to keep saying it every time. He is not abandoning his ministry to the Jews. They always are his first call. I'll never forget it. 5 years ago or so, Brian taught in Journey, and it was one of the big takeaways. He kept saying it over and over. Paul never abandoned his ministry to the Jews. In fact, he always went to them first, based on what the story of God was. And then, after he had marginal success, and they kicked him out, the people that didn't buy it, he would go to the Gentiles. That's what this phrase means, going to the Gentiles. It means literally leaving the synagogue as a means to speak for a period of time because the door is closing on him. Verse 7, then Paul left there, went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God whose house was next to the synagogue. So this is probably a Jewish guy at the synagogue, living next to the synagogue, that gets converted. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, so he's the president or the head of this local chapter, if you will, believed in the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and were being baptized. This would, of course, created more problems for Paul. Because not only are Jews coming to Jesus, remember this problem with Claudius in Rome. So this is already creating a problem in the synagogue. Now the president, the leader of the synagogue, has decided to follow Jesus. Verse 9. Now this abrupt shift that Luke makes. And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city. And he settled there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. With zero introduction, with zero kind of explanation by Luke, he just jumps into this assumption that Paul is afraid. And the text says the Lord showed up. This is Jesus, actually, again, on Paul's behalf, showing up and speaking truth and comfort into this guy. He writes about this in his first letter to the Corinthians after he leaves the church and writes a letter back to them in the second chapter, verse 3, when he says this, I, Paul, was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. I don't think, by the way, he kind of had this deep sense of inadequacy that he no longer remembered the story of God and didn't have the gift of teaching and couldn't speak. I don't think that's what it is, because he's continually going to the synagogue. I don't think, by the way, this is also a fear of being around sinful people. Paul is so used to being around idolatry and pagans. I mean, Brian's talk on Athens, if you didn't listen to it last week, go online and listen to it. That was just an incredible message about Athens and how he adapted himself to these people. He's used to being around hugely sinful people. You have to remember what Paul has gone through. He has just undergone the deepest antagonism from his brothers and sisters, his Jewish brethren, beyond anything that the imagination can grasp. This guy has been shoved out of cities. He has been pursued literally hundreds of miles on foot to go wherever he goes to stomp out his message and to get him to be either injured or killed. He has been drug out of cities like in Lystra and stoned to an inch of his life and left for dead. You cannot blame this guy for getting derailed a little bit, can you? And I love how sensitive God is to this. There's no, and Jesus showed up and said, where is your faith? Right? There's no Jesus showing up and saying, what's wrong with you after I appeared to you physically in Damascus, I took you down to Sinai for 3 years and taught you personally, and you're afraid? What's wrong with you? There's none of that. In essence, what God does is he reassures him, and he reminds him, and he recalls him. And you might even wonder, well, why would God have to recall a guy that's already been called? God doesn't tell him anything he didn't know already. For me, this is so helpful to see this. I mean, Paul, when you read Paul, you get deluded into, and I have, by the way, the chief amongst you, that he's like the man of steel, right? He just take him outside, stone him to death. Yep, he's dead. It's like a Monty Python skit. They go back in. Paul just jumps up, dusts himself off, and goes right back in. Da, da, da. That is such a load of garbage. And this proves it to us. He's like us. He's derailed. He's scared. He's beaten down. He's questioning. By the way, this is faith. See, faith isn't just, I believe. Faith is a wrestle. Faith is, I believe, I want to believe, I'm not sure I believe, I'm kind of believe, I'm not sure, where are you? And God says, thank you for wrestling. This is faith. And I love that God is totally aware of where he's at. He's comfortable with this, and he steps into it with him. Look at verse 12. But while Gallio, another weird switch, was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat. Boy, we've heard this before, right? And isn't this fascinating when you put verse 11 next to verse 12? Don't worry, I'm with you, I'll take care of you, they won't harm you. And while Jesus is finishing his speech, they're grabbing Paul and dragging him out before the judgment seat, before this guy. Again, if you're a skeptic, which I'm totally great with, if you're a person that likes to know, how do I know these things I read in the Bible are true? This Gallio character, this is a real gem for those of you that like history, maybe don't know the history of this guy, and like proof of the Bible. This is actually, if you know the history of Rome, he's actually the younger brother of the famous philosopher Seneca. Have you heard of Seneca? Seneca was actually the tutor of Nero himself when Nero was a boy. And this is when Nero wasn't nuts. But the problem, as the story goes, was that Nero's mother was nuts. And as Seneca, this great writer and philosopher, mentored her son, she began to grow weary of Seneca and grabbed Seneca and threw him into exile. And so she could have a greater influence on creating this crazy man that she so successfully did. Gallio, this younger brother of Seneca, who's in a position of authority, gains this position as the proconsul of Achaia under Emperor Claudius, the same emperor that tossed the Jews out of Rome. Interestingly enough, because of this character, we can actually fix exactly when this part of the text is. Do you remember a few weeks back when Paul visited Philippi, I talked about this slave girl that, remember, she followed him back and forth every day. She had the spirit of Python. She had the pit. She was a Pythia. Remember this? The prophetess from Delphi. Delphi is not a city. Delphi was a temple area that they went to worship and got their prophecies read and then left. Remember all this? I don't know if you remember this when Paul was in Philippi. Archaeologists discovered in this area of Delphi, you can see how close it was, an inscription that until then they had not known who this Gallio was. They found an inscription with Gallio's name on it as the proconsul of Achaia, dating to AD 51. Coincidence? I think not. That was rather weak of you, by the way. Coincidence? I love this. I'm not a person that needs a ton of proof, but it's everywhere. And this is a museum at Delphi near the ruins of this place. Apparently, this Gallio left office just a year later for health reasons. So we know exactly when this part of the story is. It's AD 51. And the text says that they brought Paul before the judgment seat. The literal translation is bema. Derek Ewan is teaching in the book of Revelation in the journey class from 9:15 to 10. It's just incredible, by the way, so if you could muster up the energy to get there, I would strongly suggest it. You'll speak about the bema, I'm sure, at some length. as this term comes up over and over, as the judgment seat of God. And it's where they would hold court. And it's a public place, as you can see, right in the market area. So we have Gallio, this proconsul, going to this public bema, and we have these Jews dragging Paul there to say, this guy's creating trouble for us. Look at verse 13. And they brought him before the bema seat, saying, this man persuades men to worship God contrary to the Torah. I mean, you should hear in this Jesus life all over again. Doesn't this sound familiar? Where Jesus, was brought before these people the same kind of way. Remember, the Jews had a level of the degree of space, if you will, to self-govern inside the Roman provinces. So they're appealing to Gallio to let them deal with Paul the way they want to deal with Paul, and normally they would allow that. They saw how serious this was in Rome. They don't want to get expelled from Corinth, and they want to put Paul down as hard as they can. Verse 14. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, notice Paul doesn't even get to speak. God has already taken care of this. Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or a vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are questions about words and names and your silly law, look after yourselves. I am unwilling to be judge of these matters. We'll find out shortly this is less than nobility on his behalf. Verse 16. And he drove them away from the bema seat. And they all took hold of Sosthenes. Notice Paul didn't let go, by the way. They took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue. This is either the replacement of Christus, now the new head of the synagogue, who has also given his life to Jesus, or one of the other main leaders, and began beating him in front of the bema seat. But Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. Again, Gallio feels like, you know what, it's one of your own, you deal with it, I don't really care. If you want to beat a guy, just don't create problems for me. One positive out of this is that Gallio doesn't have a problem with Christianity. He doesn't have a problem with Jesus. He just doesn't want a problem in his city. And this is actually a very positive thing for the kingdom. Verse 18. Paul, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria, and with him were Priscilla and Aquila. In Cenchreae he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. Cenchreae, which we mentioned before, is the lower of the port, if you will, of the two ports of Corinth. And we learned at the end of Romans that there's actually a church there. There's my beautiful bride standing on the ruins of the seaport. It's kind of neat. The water's so through there. You can see just pilings, these pillars underneath the water from the old port that was there in ancient times. We don't know specifically what this vow was that Paul took. We do know it's a Nazirite vow out of the Torah. A Nazirite vow was something that the Jews made a vow to God, and they were either doing it to have, it's almost like a fast. It's a dedicated period of time where they would either be in thankfulness for past blessings that God had given them, or they were praying for future blessings that they wanted God to give them. And they would do things like cut their hair during this kind of thing. This is why you see Samson the judge. He was under a Nazirite vow in the Old Testament. The biggest thing, they weren't allowed to be around dead things. That's why, again, during the story of Samson, if you remember that in the Old Testament, he touches the dead animal, gets the honey out of the lion. He's breaking his Nazirite vow. That's the problem with that. He as a Nazirite could not touch that thing, this vow. And then they would never touch alcohol, particularly anything to do with wine. They couldn't even handle grapes, let alone eat grapes. So it's a deep, deep thing. The reason I think Luke is pointing this weird fact out to us is one of the biggest accusations they will make about Paul when he hits Jerusalem is that he's not a pious Jew. And Luke just tosses in this little verse to let us know, don't ever think that this is not a pious Jew. Paul followed the Torah to a T. Verse 19. And they came to Ephesus, and when he left them there, meaning Priscilla and Aquila. And Paul himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews there, of course. And when they asked him to stay for a longer time, he did not consent, but taking leave of them and saying, I will return to you again if God wills. Then he set sail for Ephesus. This is the first mention we have, by the way, of Ephesus. I think the reason Paul is in such a hurry and will not stay with them is he's trying to get back to Jerusalem. He's trying to get to Jerusalem before Passover. If we already know the date. We know that it was AD 51 was when Gallio was the proconsul. Passover, the following year in AD 52, was in early April. The seas were actually closed for sailing, if you will, if you had a brain, from about late October till mid-March. So we know this is about mid-March to late March in AD 52. That's specific. And Paul's in a hurry. He wants to get back to the church of Jerusalem, and he wants to get back to his city for Passover. And we know this because in the text, it's a weird deal. It says he actually, look at verse 22. When he had landed at Caesarea, he went up. We know that's Jerusalem. He went up and greeted the church, and then he went down to Antioch. The only way you go up north to Antioch by going down is the way we refer to Jerusalem. So it's always going down. So this is the completion of Paul's missionary journey. He starts in Antioch by land. He gets all the way around by land down to Corinth. He jogs over to Ephesus, and he lands in Caesarea, goes and sees the church in Caesarea during Passover, and then he marches right back up to the church in Antioch. And this is the end of this second missionary journey. What I want to do is just close with a few thoughts that kind of work together for me as I was processing this passage. And they're I say this every week, they're rather obvious thoughts, that's why I see them. But they're really significant, I think. First of all, we are all susceptible to being discouraged. Not if you get discouraged. When you get discouraged, realize God expects this. You won't find anybody in the entire story of the Bible that is more convinced of his calling than Paul. I will also go on a limb to say, you will be hard-pressed to find a guy with greater faith and conviction than Paul. You'll be very hard-pressed to find anywhere in the story a guy, and we could debate this, and it'd be a stupid debate, and I don't really care who wins, but boy is he in the top three, of a guy who has been through more on behalf of the kingdom of God than Paul. And yet, here we find him sort of derailed, discouraged, a little depressed, down, frustrated, not wanting to get out of bed to do yet another day. This is normal. What's important to see is what Paul does and doesn't do with it. First of all, what Paul doesn't do when he's discouraged is isolate himself. He is ever with Priscilla and Aquila and his other believers. So much so that when he leaves to go back to Passover, he says, "Will you go with me?" And takes them as far as Ephesus. Paul does not isolate when he's in discouragement. The great lie of the enemy, when you and I get down, is isolate. Do you know this in your own life? There's this feeling of, I feel lousy, I'm doing lousy, my perspective is off, I'm crabby, I'm grumpy, I don't see God, my life's not going well, and you just want to ball up into the infancy phase and just be by yourself. And I'm not talking about a little alone time. I'm not talking about like me on Sunday afternoons where I'm kind of wiped out from Sunday mornings and I get on my mountain bike for an hour and a half. I just kind of need to just be by myself for a little bit. That's a healthy thing. I'm talking about isolation. It's the kryptonite to believers. And this is the single greatest thing the enemy tries to get you and I do. Don't be around your brothers and sisters. Don't be around people in Christ that know you and that know what you're like and can call you on where you're at. Because then you'd be encouraged. Then you'll gain perspective. We're made in the image of the Trinity. The Father and the Son and the Spirit are never not in union. So Satan, knowing this, says, well, if they're made in that image, the greatest way to attack them is to rip them apart from him. So take them out into isolation. And Paul does not buy into any of this. The other thing is, when Paul not only doesn't isolate himself, he leans back into the faithful history of God. When God says to him, I am with you, and I will not leave you, and I will not harm you. What is he tapping into for that? How does Paul know that's even true? says to himself, okay, I'm really discouraged. God, Jesus, you're telling me that you're not going to leave me. How do I know that's true? Well, I'm going to see if I remember. You never left Adam or Eve. You never left Moses. You didn't leave Jacob, and what a schlep, and you still wouldn't leave him. Or Joseph, or Abraham, or Moses, or Elijah, who was just weak at times and wondering at times and blaming God at times, and Elisha, and you name it. He didn't leave Jeremiah, who sat there saying, God, I don't want this anymore. I don't want you anymore. I don't want any part of this calling anymore. Right? Paul sat and remembered that story. He leaned on the faithful history of God and said, I will give him the benefit of the doubt moving forward. The second thought that I think works in conjunction with this first thought is everywhere Paul goes, he encounters beauty and darkness. And they're side by side. He doesn't like, oh, here's some beauty, and that lasted a few days, and here's some darkness. No, they're side by side. Lynn and I really enjoy going to the movies if they're decent. We've seen some really good movies. Wow, we saw 12 Years a Slave yesterday. I just want to go through a box of Kleenex. Just, there's two things that I can't get my brain wrapped around. It's the whole slavery deal and the Holocaust. And every time I see them, I don't know if you saw the book, the same deal. You just go, this is so atrocious, my mind can't go there. And yet in the midst of the darkness, you see this beauty and this light taking place at the same time. Again, Jesus shows up in a vision and says, I'm with you. And he gets drawn out to the Bema Seat. Beauty and darkness, side by side. The synagogue ruler says, you know what? He is the Messiah. I'm going to bow my knee to Jesus. And what does he get for it? He gets a nice beating out of it. Beauty sitting next to darkness. If we only see one, we're missing it. If we walk around thinking, oh, everything's just marvelous, you are living in the Matrix. This is a dark pit. I woke up this morning, got to my phone, and there's a text first thing this morning from a brother that doesn't live here anymore because he doesn't know what to do because he has a junior hire that just had got involved in a bunch of junk while they were out to dinner that night. That's darkness. Just dark. And the beauty of it was, another brother here already called him this morning and said, let me walk you through this. I went through the same thing. Beauty and darkness. But also, we're not called to a life of depression, right? Jesus wins. Jesus is alive. He's resurrected. We have our hope. It's not just dark. Aslan's paws are walking across the meadow, turning them green on every single footstep. It's what David said, yea, though I walk through the valley of death. He didn't say, yea, though I went through that, but it's way in my past, right? You know Psalm 23, yea, though I'm in the valley of the shadow of death. What does he say? Finish it for me. I will fear no evil. Why? The rest of it's just presence of God stuff. Because the beauty of God is with me. Beauty and darkness, side by side. We need to see both. And this last thought, that again is tied to these first two, is what I see in Paul and what he does and doesn't do. The goal is not, in Paul's mind, ministry. The goal is to be next to God. Notice, first of all, what's missing from what God says to Paul. Jesus doesn't show up and say, Paul, you're going to be successful in your ministry. Is that anywhere in the text? No. What does he say? Keep talking. That's what he says. Just keep at it. Just keep at it. Number 2, I won't let him harm you. Number 3, I won't leave you. That's what he tells you. Paul doesn't wake up and ask God to be with him today because God is already with him. The Spirit of Jesus dwells within his heart. It's a silly prayer to Paul. Paul just wants to know where God already has placed work so that he can stand there and view it with God. And you can see how active God has been in this story, right? When Paul maybe not even is even aware of it. Look at these coincidences. He meets Priscilla and Aquila. They just so happen to be believers. They just so happen to be leaven makers. They just so happen to be people that are mobile and will come and go as he goes. Notice, while Paul lays down in discouragement to sleep, God's been awake all night long. Isn't that great? We don't get up in the morning and say, God, wake up and be with me today. God's been up all night preparing your day. All day, all night. And we wake up and say, God, please may I have eyes to see and ears to hear where you are. Let's pray. Jesus, you are the same one that showed up in the night to encourage Paul, that dwells in every one of us that have called you our Lord and our Savior. We thank you for that. We thank you that you have the same desire to encourage us, to uplift us, to make your presence felt. Would you give us eyes to see as a church and ears to hear? And Father, for those that are here this morning that don't know this intimacy with you, would you make yourself obvious to them so that they might see that you are their intended king? We pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.
I want to invite